During the Eurozone crisis, there was a fair bit of talk about Eurobonds. In other words, some sort of common public debt for the euro area. At the time, it was basically rejected because more fiscally responsible Eurozone states didn't like the idea of debt sharing with their less fiscally responsible neighbours. But the idea has suddenly experienced somewhat of a comeback. This time not as a means to bail out some bankrupt member state, but rather to create a European alternative to the US Treasury market, which is looking increasingly shaky under Trump. So, in this video, we're going to explain why Treasuries have long been the world's favourite bond, how Trump has undermined all this, and how Eurobonds could provide a viable alternative. Don't feel overwhelmed by endless news stories. Find out what you need to know every day with TLDR's Daily Briefing. Listen along in your favourite podcast app or by clicking the link in the description. So, we first need to explain what we mean by a reserve asset. In short, a reserve asset is just something that central banks and other big fiscal institutions like to hold in their foreign exchange reserves. This is usually because these assets are considered particularly safe, in that their value is stable and they can be easily bought or sold. When people talk about reserve assets, they're usually talking about currencies, and specifically the US dollar, which has been the world's reserve currency since at least World War II. The dollar's reserve status bestows some advantages upon the US, including a stronger dollar and reduced exchange rate risk. However, at least as advantageous for the US is the fact that US government bonds, or Treasuries, are effectively the world's reserve bond. In other words, if you want a safe investment, but you want a better return than just plonking your money into cash, Treasuries are your go-to. This is great news for the US, because this additional reserve-related demand for Treasuries allows the US government to borrow more money than it would be able to otherwise. So, why are Treasuries the world's reserve bond? Well, it's at least partly because of the dollar's reserve status. Treasuries are more attractive because they can be bought with and sold for dollars. But it's also for at least two other reasons. First, the US has long been perceived as a beacon of economic strength and security. The US has been, by most metrics, the wealthiest large economy in the world since World War II. With a developed financial system and well-respected financial institutions like the Federal Reserve, which are supposed to guarantee economic stability. This combination of economic strength and institutionally guarded stability gave markets confidence that the US would be able to pay off its debts for the foreseeable future. The second and slightly paradoxical reason is the size of the US Treasury market, which is massive because, well, the US likes issuing debt. Now, you might assume that more debts would make it harder to pay off. However, while that's true to some extent, the sheer number of treasuries in circulation has also made the treasury market more liquid than any other bond market in the world. In other words, because there are so many of them floating around, buying or selling a treasury at market value is very easy. This stands in contrast to, say, the German bond or Bund market. Because Germany doesn't issue that much debt, there aren't that many bunds floating about, so it's harder to find buyers or sellers. However, Trump has made treasuries less attractive in at least three ways. First, most economists expect Trump's tariffs to reduce America's growth rate. Second, Trump's loose fiscal policy, as outlined in the Big Beautiful Bill, means that the US is due to run deficits of about 6% of GDP for the foreseeable future. This is enormous by historical and international standards, and has cast doubt on America's ultimate ability to pay its debts. Third, Trump has pressured the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates faster, and will probably appoint a more pliant successor when Jerome Powell's term ends next year. This will increase the risk of premature interest rate cuts and thus high inflation, which would erode the real value of treasuries. However, while there has been some movement out of treasuries, as evidenced by the recent rise in yields, the movement hasn't been as dramatic as expected. Treasury yields are still pretty manageable, despite America's massive deficit, and treasuries clearly remain the world's reserve bond of choice. This seems to be largely because, well, there's still no good alternative to treasuries. This is in part because the American economy is still doing better than most of its peers, but it's also because no other market is large or liquid enough to replace the treasury market. Even if you think Germany, for instance, is more creditworthy than the US, you might be reluctant to move out of Treasuries and into bonds, because the bond market is just way less liquid than the Treasury market. The most obvious solution here would be to pool the European debt into a unified Eurobond market, with sufficient depth and liquidity to compete with the Treasury market. This is already sort of happening. The EU has already issued some 300 billion euros worth of bonds via the COVID Recovery Fund, and is now planning to issue a further 150 billion euros as part of the Rearm Europe programme, and possibly a further 400 billion euros as part of a new crisis tool. But while these numbers might sound big, these instruments would collectively take the EU's outstanding debt burden to about $1 trillion, trivial in comparison to the $27 trillion Treasury market. Instead, Europe would probably have to pool its existing debt, i.e. take a whole load of German, French and Italian bonds and convert them into Eurobonds, creating one massive big market to rival the Treasury market. There are at least 3 reasons to think Eurobonds stand a better chance than they did in the 2010s. First, if Eurobonds can replace Treasuries, that will both lead to way lower borrowing costs for Europe and give the EU more leverage over Trump. Second, there's no longer as stark a divide between the frugal northern countries and the spendthrift southerners. Germany is issuing more debt, while southern European countries like Italy, Spain and Greece have made impressive progress consolidating their public finances. And third, there are ways to design Eurobonds to mitigate the various risks. The most popular proposal at the moment, for instance, involves converting some set amount of debt, measured relative to GDP, for each Eurozone country into Eurobonds or blue debt, and then leaving any debt above that level as national debt or red debt. This blue debt would become cheaper, but the red debt would probably become more expensive, providing an extra incentive for fiscally irresponsible countries to bring their debt levels down to nearer the blue level. The other advantage to this system is that it scales. You could start by converting, say, debt worth 10% of GDP into blue bonds, and if it worked, you could increase that fraction. Ultimately, while it still feels unlikely, if designed correctly, Eurobonds could finally create a much-needed alternative to Treasuries. As you may know already, here at TLDR we're committed to learning about the world around us, and helping you do the exact same. Luckily for all of us, our sponsor this week, Brilliant, helps with just that. Brilliant helps you become a better thinker and problem solver, with thousands of visual, interactive lessons in maths, science, programming, data analysis and AI. Not only does Brilliant offer a perfect mix of engaging problems and competitive features, it also keeps you motivated with daily encouragement, and their app makes it easy to learn wherever you are. Instead of mindless scrolling, with those extra pockets of time you find in the day, you can give your mind a workout with Brilliant's growing collection of programming courses. From learning Python to developing an intuition for computer logic, you'll get hands-on experience with real programs and learn to think like a programmer, building your problem-solving skills to thrive in the evolving world of programming. Plus, all content on Brilliant is crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers and professionals from Stanford, MIT, Caltech, Microsoft, Google and more. To start your learning journey and try Brilliant for free, visit brilliant.org/TLDR. Scan the QR code on your screen, or you can click the link in the description. By doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know that you came from us, which really helps us out.